You are not lonely because you failed at relationships. You might just be running a system that filters most people out. And the strange part is, it is not even conscious. It does not feel like a decision. There's no clear moment where you say, I don't want friends. Instead, it happens quietly. Gradually, you start noticing that most conversations feel the same. Predictable, repetitive, slightly forced. You respond, but without energy. You listen, but without curiosity. And after a while, you begin to pull back. Not dramatically. Not in a way that others would immediately notice. Just small adjustments, fewer replies, longer pauses. Less initiation. From the outside, it can look like disconnection, like something is missing. But from the inside, it feels different. It feels like you are protecting something. Your time, your attention, your mental clarity. And you cannot fully explain why. But certain interactions feel heavier than they should. Like they require more energy than they give back. So you start choosing silence more often. Not because silence is exciting, but because it is clean. There is no pressure to respond, no need to perform, no hidden expectations, just space. And in that space, your mind settles. This is where the paradox begins, because the world is built on the assumption that more connection is always better. More friends, more conversations, more engagement. And when you do not follow that pattern, it creates a quiet tension, a question that lingers in the background. Is something wrong with me? But what if the question itself is wrong? What if the issue is not your ability to connect, but the type of connection your mind is willing to accept? Most social environments are designed for speed, quick exchanges, light topics, constant stimulation. But not every mind is wired for that. Some minds process more, notice more, filter more. And when that happens, the cost of interaction increases. So instead of gaining energy from social input, you lose it. And when something consistently drains you, your system adapts. It reduces exposure. It creates distance, not as a flaw, but as a form of regulation. That is why this is hard to explain to others, because from their perspective, connection is simple, natural, effortless. But for you, it is selective, conditional, dependent on something deeper that is not always visible on the surface. So you end up in a space that looks like isolation, but does not feel like emptiness. It feels like control. And maybe that is the part no one talks about. You are not avoiding people. You are filtering reality. And until you see that clearly, you will keep trying to fix something that was never broken in the first place. You wake up with good intentions, maybe even a plan. Today will be different. You will reach out more, be more present. Say yes to things you usually avoid. For a moment, it feels possible. Then the day begins. You open your laptop. 10 tabs. Messages blinking. Notifications stacking. Someone sends a casual hey, and you pause. Not because you do not want to reply, but because you already feel the weight of the conversation before it even starts. You think about what to say, how long it might last, whether it will go anywhere. And somehow, you rarely feel ready. By midday, your energy is already fragmented. You switch between tasks, half-finished thoughts, background noise everywhere, a quick conversation here, a notification there. Nothing overwhelming on its own, but together, it creates a constant low-level drain. And this is where it becomes confusing, because technically, you are still functioning. You're working, responding, engaging, but internally, something feels off. Your focus is shallow. Your patience is shorter. And even simple interactions start to feel heavier than they should. So when someone suggests meeting or calling, or even just talking longer than expected, your first reaction is hesitation, Not rejection. Hesitation. You start calculating. How much energy will this take? How long will it last? Will I need time alone after? And most importantly, is it worth it? And often, the answer is unclear, or no. So you say you are busy, or you postpone, or you simply do not follow up. Again, not as a clear decision, just small acts of withdrawal that accumulate over time. From the outside, it can look like inconsistency, like you are not trying hard enough, like you are losing connections. But the real mechanism is different. Your environment is overloaded with low-quality inputs, constant stimulation, surface-level conversations, fragmented attention, and your mind, instead of adapting to it, resists it because your brain is not designed for constant switching. It is designed for depth, for focus, for meaning. So every time you engage in something that lacks those elements, it creates friction, and friction feels like exhaustion. This is why small talk drains you faster than deep conversation. Why casual interactions feel heavier than meaningful ones. Why a short but shallow exchange can cost more energy than a long, focused discussion. But here is the problem. Most social systems are built on frequency, not depth. Quick check-ins, frequent replies, continuous engagement. And if your brain does not align with that structure, you start falling out of sync. Not because you cannot connect, but because the system you are placed in is not built for how you process the world. So over time, your behavior changes, less initiation, less participation, more silence. And eventually, it starts to look like isolation. But underneath that, it is something else entirely. It is a system mismatch, not a personality flaw. At some point, you stop trying to fix it, not out of defeat, but out of observation. You notice that every time you force yourself to be more social, more available, more responsive, it works for a while. You can push through a few conversations, show up, engage, even appear completely normal from the outside. But afterward, there is always a cost, a quiet fatigue, a need to withdraw, a subtle resistance that builds the more you ignore it. And that pattern repeats. Effort, followed by exhaustion. Engagement, followed by recovery. Over and over again. So you begin to question something deeper. What if the problem is not your effort, but the direction of that effort? Because forcing yourself to behave like everyone else has never actually made things easier. It has only made things heavier. And that is the moment where the frame begins to shift. You realize your mind is not rejecting connection. It is rejecting inefficiency. Not all interactions are equal. Some are neutral. Some are energizing. And some are quietly draining in ways that are hard to detect in real time. Your brain picks up on that difference, even when you cannot immediately explain it. Tone, intention, authenticity, depth, small signals, processed automatically. And when those signals do not align, your system responds with resistance, not because you're antisocial, but because your brain is optimizing for something else. Clarity. This is where the misunderstanding usually happens. Most people measure social success by quantity. How often you talk, how many people you know, how quickly you respond. But your system does not use that metric. That measures by signal quality. Does this interaction feel real? Does it lead somewhere meaningful? Does it respect your mental space? If the answer is no, your system flags it as noise. And once you see that clearly, something important changes. You stop labeling your behavior as avoidance. You start recognizing it as filtration. That single shift removes a lot of unnecessary pressure, because now you are not trying to increase your social output blindly. You are refining your input, and that leads to a different question. Not, how do I become more social? But, what kind of interaction is actually worth my energy? That question is slower, more precise, and slightly uncomfortable. Because it forces honesty. You begin to see why certain conversations felt empty. Why some people drained you without doing anything obviously wrong. Why silence often felt better than participation, not because silence is superior, but because it is cleaner than noise. And here is the key. Realization. Your system is not broken. It is selective. And selectivity, when misunderstood, looks like isolation. But when understood, it becomes a form of control. You are not losing connection. You are raising the threshold for it. And once that becomes clear, you stop trying to lower your standards just to fit into a system that was never designed for you in the first place. So instead of trying to become more social, you shift your focus to something more practical. You redesign the system, not your personality, not your preferences, just the structure around how you interact with the world. Because once you understand that your energy is limited and your mind filters more than average, the goal is no longer to increase interaction. It is to improve the quality of it while protecting your capacity. So you keep it simple. 3 adjustments. Nothing extreme. Nothing unrealistic. Just small structural changes that you can apply immediately. First, you reduce meaningless exposure. This does not mean isolating yourself. It means becoming intentional about what you allow in. Not every message needs an instant reply. Not every conversation needs to be continued. You give yourself permission to pause, to not engage, to let low-value interactions pass without guilt. A simple internal rule helps here. If it feels performative, you step back. No overthinking, no justification, just quiet filtration. This alone removes a surprising amount of mental noise. Because instead of reacting to everything, you begin choosing. Second, you design for depth. Most people wait for meaningful conversations to appear randomly, but your system does not work well with randomness. So you create conditions where depth is more likely. Fewer people, slower pace, clearer intent. Instead of 5 short conversations, you allow space for one real exchange. You ask better questions. You stay longer when the interaction has substance. And when it does not, you do not force it. Imagine a simple stick figure. It stands between 2 doors. One leads to a crowded room filled with constant chatter. The other leads to a quiet space with one person having a focused conversation. In the past, you felt pressure to choose the crowded room. Now, you choose based on alignment, not expectation. Third, you protect recovery time. This is where most people fail because they treat social energy as unlimited. But for you, it is not. So you treat it like a resource. After interaction, you schedule space, silence, no input, no demands. Just enough time for your system to reset, not as an escape, but as maintenance. Think of that same stick figure again. It enters a social environment. Its energy bar drops steadily. Then it steps out, sits alone, and slowly the bar fills back up. That cycle is not a weakness. It is your rhythm. And once you respect that rhythm, everything becomes more stable. You stop overcommitting. You stop forcing yourself to stay longer than necessary. You stop confusing exhaustion with failure. Instead, you move between interaction and solitude with awareness. And the result is subtle. You are still selective, still quiet, still not constantly engaged. But now, it feels intentional. Not accidental. Not something you need to fix. Just a system that finally fits how your mind actually works. At first, nothing dramatic happens. You do not suddenly become more social. You do not wake up with a completely different personality. From the outside, your life looks almost the same, but internally, something begins to shift. The constant tension starts to fade. That quiet pressure, the feeling that you should be doing more, replying faster, engaging more often. It slowly loses its grip. not because you forced it away, but because your system no longer creates the same friction. You're no longer pushing against your own nature every day. And that changes how your energy behaves. You feel less scattered, less drained by small interactions, less mentally overloaded by things that used to seem harmless, but quietly accumulated over time, because now you are not absorbing everything. You are filtering. That alone creates space to think more clearly, space to focus longer, space to actually be present. When something matters and over time, your interactions begin to change, not in quantity, but in quality. You may talk to fewer people, but the conversations that remain feel more real, less forced, less performative. You listen more carefully, you respond with intention. And because you are not constantly exhausted, you have more capacity when it actually counts. This is where consistency begins to show, not as intensity, not as sudden bursts of effort, but as a steady pattern. You engage when it aligns. You step back when you need to. You recover without guilt. And you repeat that cycle again and again without burning out. That rhythm is sustainable. And sustainability is what most people miss. They rely on motivation, on phases of high energy, on temporary decisions to be better. But those systems break because they are built on intensity. Yours is different. It is built on compatibility. You are not trying to maximize output. You are trying to maintain balance. And in the long run, balance wins because it allows you to keep going without needing to constantly reset. Another subtle change appears over time. You stop blaming yourself. That internal narrative, I should be different, I should try harder, it becomes quieter, not completely gone, but less dominant. Because your results no longer contradict your nature. You are not failing at connection. You are refining it. And that creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not visible, but stable. You trust your own boundaries more. You understand your limits without judgment. And you no longer feel the need to explain your choices to everyone around you because they make sense to you. And that is enough. Slowly, your environment adjusts as well. People who expect constant availability may drift away, not through conflict, just through mismatch. And in their place, you begin to notice something else. Fewer interactions, but more aligned ones, conversations that do not feel like effort, silence that does not feel awkward, presence that does not require performance. It does not happen quickly, but it happens naturally. And that is the point. You are not forcing change. You are allowing the right patterns to remain, while the wrong ones fade. Less noise, more clarity, less pressure, more control. Not a bigger life, but a cleaner one. And over time, that difference becomes everything. Maybe nothing about you needs to be fixed. That idea can feel unfamiliar at first, because for a long time, you have been measuring yourself against systems that were never designed for you. Systems that reward constant interaction, fast responses, high social output. And when you could not keep up with that rhythm, it quietly turned into self-doubt. But now, you can see it differently. You were not falling behind. You were filtering. You were not avoiding connection. You were protecting your clarity. And that distinction matters more than it seems, because once you stop treating your nature like a problem, you stop searching for extreme solutions. You stop forcing yourself into environments that drain you. You stop chasing a version of yourself that only works under conditions that exhaust you. Instead, you begin to build around what is already true. You recognize that your energy is selective, that your attention is precise, that your mind values depth over frequency. And rather than trying to override those traits, you start working with them. Quietly, consistently, without pressure. This does not mean you will never feel doubt again. There will still be moments where you question yourself. Moments where the silence feels a little too long. Moments where you wonder if you should try harder, reach out more, be more like everyone else. But now, you have a reference point. You understand the architecture of your own system, and that understanding gives you something most people never develop. Choice. You can engage. Without losing yourself, you can step back. Without guilt, you can be alone. Without labeling it as failure. That is a different kind of stability, not built on external validation, but on internal alignment. And over time, that alignment becomes your baseline. You stop reacting to every expectation around you. You stop adjusting your behavior just to fit into conversations that do not matter. You become quieter but clearer, more selective, but more present. And the irony is, that is often when real connection finally appears, not because you chased it, but because you stopped accepting what did not fit. So, if you have been moving through life with fewer connections than expected, maybe the goal is not to change that immediately. Maybe the goal is to understand it. To see what your mind has been protecting all along, and to build a system that respects that instead of fighting it. Because you do not need to become a different person. You need a different structure. One that allows you to function without constant resistance. One that makes consistency feel natural, not forced. If any part of this felt familiar, you are not the only one experiencing it. You are just one of the few who started noticing. Comment system if you have ever felt this pattern, even quietly. And if you want to keep refining how your mind works, one layer at a time, you can subscribe. Not for more noise, but for more clarity.